segment, which, as JV said, is risk assessment. So we're in a situation where we have gone through a risk identification process. We've held some workshops. We've reviewed our documentation. And now we have got 100, 200, 300 risks potentially. What do we do with them? It's unmanageable if you had to address them all. And so what we need to do is to have a close look at what has just landed on our plates, review and say, okay, what is it that we're trying to achieve? So what we're trying to achieve is to take this big pile of risks and say, what are we going to do with them? It's very good to know why we are doing things before we say, what are we going to do? So let's answer that question very quickly in terms of why do we do this step? What is its purpose? And what we are looking to do is to bring some objectivity to this. Now, it's difficult because we're talking about the future. And so it's very difficult. And we're talking about things that by definition may not happen. So it's very difficult to be properly objective. It's not 100% impossible in some cases, but at a minimum, we're looking for a common framework with agreed protocols for the discussion. So that's the first one. The second one is, and this for me is the main one, if you've got over 100 risks, you need to address those that have the greatest leverage. You cannot give the same focus and the same level to all of them. It's not possible, and neither is it desirable. You need to select a strategy to say, for this risk, what are our options? How are we going to approach it in broad terms? We need a tool that brings focus to stakeholders outside of the project to say, this is what we're dealing with. People don't like to talk about risks, but we have to, because often we need people to pay attention to say, this is what we have on our plates. Be aware of it. And the last one is ownership. We haven't spoken very much about ownership, but it is, once we have decided on the priority risks, we need to allocate owners for each one who will drive the responses to those that have been selected for the management of those risks. So ownership is a crucial thing that we must pay attention to. So how do we do all of that? Well, it actually boils down to two very simple questions. What is the likelihood of this risk materializing? Excuse me. Question number one. And question number two, what would the likely effect be on our project objectives if it were to materialize? So we've got something that is uncertain, so it may or may not happen, but how likely is it? And secondly, what would the effect be on our project objectives if it were to materialize? The first we call probability. What is the probability of this risk? And the second we call impact. And we look at those independently. So we give them scales. So the two questions are in the bubbles to the top of the slide, and we rate probability on a 5-point scale and impact on a 5-point scale, and we label those scales from very low through low, medium, high, up to very high on both of them. So there's no rule that says it has to be 5 by 5. I've seen 3 by 3, 4 by 4, 7 by 7, 4 by 3. They don't even have to be equal. I think I've heard about a 10 by 10, but I can't imagine that that's very practical. So each risk is rated separately and independent on both of these two, on each of these two. For each risk, we say, what is the probability of you happening? And if you were to happen, what is the impact? Having rated those on those scales, we then go to the next risk and the next and the next. So what we're trying to do here is, we've mentioned a degree of objectivity or at least consistency. And so how do we decide which of these labels to use in a given situation? Suppose it's you and me talking about it. And I'm thinking that this is probably going to happen, probably not very high, but it should be high. But if it were to happen, it would be a medium, and you might say, I actually think that the probability is very high, but if it were to happen, it would be low. Now, how do we resolve this debate? On two things. One is, how do we resolve this debate for this risk, and how do we make sure that when we're having a similar discussion tomorrow, that we are consistent? And so the problem that we have here, we're talking about something that might happen or might not happen. If it does, it would happen in the future. So we can't be sure. The Danish physicist Niels Bohr is quoted as having said, prediction is very difficult, especially about the future. And that's kind of what we're dealing with. So we have to understand when we're dealing with risk that our estimation of what might happen in future has to be firstly an estimate, hopefully more than a guess, and that's why what we are doing in this segment of our class today. And B, we have to accept that it's subjective. If you and I come to an agreement that it's medium and high, then it was simply an agreement. There's no science to it. But maybe we can do better than just using this very low to very high. So what would that look like? Well, what we do under probability is we might agree that we can assign a percentage probability. And we might agree that if something is less than 5% of likelihood, then we'll treat it as irrelevant, not possible. And if it's more than 95% likely that it'll happen, then we will treat it as if it has happened, and we'll put our contingencies or our emergency plan in place. And so therefore, our 5-point scale goes from 5 to 95%. And that's just the example that we're using here. Now, you could argue, how do I distinguish between 74 and 75%? Again, it's subjective, but possibly it is something that we could agree on and at least find some way of bringing some level of consistency to these terms. Looking at impact is harder. If you look at the left-hand side, budgets, we can put numbers to, and time we can put numbers to. In other words, if we've got a budget, we know what a 10% increase in overrun is. Or if we're talking about opportunities, what a 10% underrun means. And if it's 40% overrun or 40% underrun in the case of an opportunity, we can put a number to that. Likewise, in time, we can put a number to it. We know the difference between 3 months and 2 weeks. What you're going to have to decide, however, is what values to put in here. So, for example, we are saying that a 1-week delay is a very low threat, and a 1-week advance is a very low opportunity. But stay with threats for a moment. If we're talking about a product launch where you've geared up a whole thing of ancillary events and things happening, then 1 week would be very, very high. So you can't take these are simply examples. You can't take them and put them into your project without having the discussion about what we mean by very low to very high. And functionality is harder because what do we mean by functionality? In this case, I've put in an example which says it's very high if the business case is no longer viable. There's no point in doing the project if this thing happens, down to very low. The business case is still viable. We just might need to cross a few I's and dot a few T's, something like that. But this is where you're going to have to be very smart about what are our objectives really, and how are we going to put values to them. And then you need to also be aware that if there's a risk, that if it were to materialize, does not have an effect on your stated project objectives, but would have an effect on an implicit objective, such as some regulatory compliance issue, then you know that you'll have to bring it in. So it's easy to overlook something which says, yeah, it might happen, but it's not in our objectives. But your auditors might say, yes, but if it were to happen, you couldn't do X, Y, Z in terms of legislation. So you need to be aware of those as well. So there's a lot of upfront discussion that we'll talk about much later on to be clear about the values that we give to the labels, very low to very high. So assume that we've done that and we've got our two. We assess the probability and the impact and we bring them together. Those two dynamics combined, we call the risks exposure. And so because there are two elements to this, it makes a lot of sense to depict them in a matrix. And so on the vertical axis, you see that we've got probability. On the horizontal axis, we've got impact. And then we can plot our risks in terms of medium probability, high impact in the case of risk A. Risk B has a low probability, but a very high impact. And so we can go with all our risks and we can plot them onto this matrix. Our shorthand for this matrix is the PI matrix. So if I talk about the PI matrix, it's the probability impact matrix. And it's obvious, if you look at, or at least it's intuitively obvious, that if we are plotting risks onto the matrix and we have high and very high probability and high and very high impact, then we'll be plotting those risks in the top right-hand corner. Those are going to be the risks with the highest exposure. And those will be the ones that get our priority in terms of initial focus efforts. So how do we distinguish between A and B? Which one has the higher exposure? Well, we don't really know. There's nothing to tell us. If it was in the far top right, and then we would intuitively know. But just looking here, we don't know which one has the higher exposure. So what we do is we go back and say, well, let's give a value to each of our labels. And so if it's very low, we give it a 1. And if it's very high, we give it a 5. We do that on both axes. And then we go back to our PI matrix. And you can see those numbers in red along the two axes, the vertical axes, 1 to 5 going up. The impact axes, 1 to 5 going from left to right. We multiply those red numbers and insert the result of the multiplication into the cell. And now we've got a number. We can say that risk A carries an exposure of 12. Risk B, an exposure of B. Therefore, we must do 12 first. So that solves that problem. But let's stay with this picture another minute. Please just have a closer look at the values in the cells. And what do you see? How many duplicates can you see? We can see probably, I can't even remember, I think it was about 8 duplicates. So we got top right, we've got 2 20s, and bottom left, we've got 2 2s, and so on. So that means that we can't distinguish between risks that are in those where there are duplicates. So does that matter? Probably not. In and of itself, it's not a disaster that invalidates the approach. But does it make sense that probability and impact carry equal weightings? What are your thoughts about that? So what I'd like you to do is to have a look and say, it doesn't matter, or it does matter, and this is the one that's more important. So I'm going to launch this poll now, and so you're going to say, what in your opinion, you're going to answer this question. What in your opinion is the relative importance of the 2 risk assessment criteria, probability and impact? Probability should carry more weight. Impact should carry more weight. They are the same, it doesn't matter. Please tell me what your thoughts are. And I'm sending it out to you. I think you can see it there now. So please select just one of those radio buttons. Keep those answers coming, please. Don't worry if you don't agree, just have a go anyway. Let's have a look at what your thoughts are. 13.6% probability should carry more weight. Impact, just over half of you say impact should carry more weight, and they are equally important and should carry equal weight. So I guess it's a judgment call. An extreme example that I use, imagine that your family owns a small guest house or small hotel where you cater for holiday makers. And you've got two risks. The one is that your guests love your cutlery and crockery and glassware, and there is a threat that they will pilfer some knives and forks and spoons and so on. Quite a high priority, but maybe not a huge impact. It's just something that you would need to keep an eye on. You've also got another risk where a fire comes through the hotel and burns it down to the ground. Very, very low probability, but a calamity if it were to occur. And most people would choose impact of those threats. Most of us would also choose impact as the more important when it comes to opportunities. We prefer to have a lower probability with a high reward than a high probability with a very low reward. And so we think, we agree with the majority of you that impact should carry the higher weighting. So let's have a look and see how we do that. We can't give them the same. So what we do here is we need to do two things. The first one is that we change our scale from whole numbers to fractions of 1 for both P and I. And secondly, so you'll see probability is 0.1 is very low and 0.9 is very high. So 0.00 would mean it is certain that it will not happen. And 1.00 is it is certain that it will happen. And it's the same on both of them. So what we do then is we use that fraction. So very low on probability is 0.01. That equates to 10%. And medium is 0.50. That equates to 50%, and so on. If you have a look at the values we've put in there, however, you will see that the probability scales are equal in distribution. They are all separated by a gap of a difference of 0.2. 0.2 between 0.1 and 0.3, 0.3 and 0.5, and so on, up to 0.9. Look at the right-hand side, and you will see that it doubles every time. So 0.05 doubled. If we double that very low value, it becomes 0.1. Double that again, it becomes 0.2. And then it goes all the way up. So now we're in a situation where you can see that we are giving greater weight to impact. And so if you have a look at these values now, you can see that, although you have to look very, very closely. What you will also see when you look closely is that we've resolved the duplicate issue as well. And so we don't have to worry about that anymore. So we've got our impact values going across the horizontal axis, and that's on a geometric scale. On the vertical scale, we've got the probability values going up on an arithmetic scale, and so that gives us vastly different values inside the cells. And so we can set thresholds. So we can say greater than 0.20, we'll make that high, requiring urgent attention. And if it's less than 0.08, we'll make it low. And if it's medium, anything in between is medium. And so it's a bit difficult just looking at these numbers, but we can color code them according to those thresholds that we agree. And voila, now we can see what the pattern is. You can very clearly see those risks which carry a rating, a risk exposure greater than 0.20, those that carry a risk exposure less than 0.08, and the medium risks that are in between. Having done that, we can then say we no longer need those values. They've served their purpose. We can go back and say the pattern tells us what is high, medium, and low, and we can then stick to a simpler approach to having a discussion around, is it very high, medium, or very low? And of course, we'll refer back to the thresholds that we set earlier on for each one of those. And so this is our approach to doing what most of you said we needed to do, and that is to give greater weighting to impact. So probability and impact are the most common ways of assessing risk exposure, but there are others as well. So here are a few: proximity, relatedness, detectability, and manageability. So let's go through those one at a time. Proximity means what is our proximity time-wise? If it were to happen, when would that be? Because if it's going to be next week, then it's obviously going to be worth our while to address it now than the risk that is only going to happen in 3 months' time. And if we don't do it in the next week, then it's going to be too late. So it is something that we could say, should we not afford urgency, if not importance, but urgency to those risks that would happen soonest? So that's what you would do if you had risks with the same PI cell. You'd look within that cell and say which one is going to happen soonest. Or you might say, let's look at relatedness. So if you, for example, in your cause-risk impact structure, in your risk meta language, found that causes were being duplicated. So a given cause would have more than one risk, which would have each of which could have the same or different effects on objectives. Then you would definitely go for that and address that cause, so that you can then address three risks with one intervention. Or detectability. How easy will it be to see that the risk is imminent? So, for example, suppose that we've got a risk has to do with pricing of things, and if prices go up, then it's going to affect our costs of manufacturing costs of our finished product. And so you're importing components, and so something that might affect your cost would be the exchange rate, the currency exchange rate between the currency that you are of the country that you're importing from relative to your home country currency rate. Now that's quite easy to see because currency rates are published on a daily basis. You can always go and look them up, and so you can definitely see when it's coming compared to import duties, where if your government decides to slap import duties on your supplier country, then that is seldom something that you can see coming. So that would be a difference of detectability, is that you would go for the currency exchange one because as soon as you can see that it's going to become a problem. It's harder to see the import duty problem coming. Manageability. How easy is it to manage your exposure? Some risks are easy to see and define, but very hard to manage, particularly when the causes are outside of your control. Like exchange control, there's nothing you can do about that. Import duties, there's nothing you can do about that. So that finishes this segment of our assessment. We've assessed our risks. perhaps I'll go back and say, look at the questions that we had at the beginning and say, JV, do we need to be an expert on the project platform we are performing a risk assessment on? No, we're just using whiteboards. You'll see in fact, the very next slide, you'll see that we're using Excel. So there's no fancy platform to assess your risks. It's more about making sure that you are following the process and involving the right people. I think that was the main one that came from assessment. Does the strategy should come from all of us after performing the risk assessment? I'm not sure exactly what that question was about. I think what we're saying is that if you're, just as you did with identifying risks, we would often do our risk assessment in a team, so that you've got joint ownership and commitment to that. If I didn't answer your question, JV, perhaps you could ask it again. So this is a good time as you go through so to JV's first question there, as we're going through our process of identifying and assessing risks, we need to keep a record of what's going on so that we can get a bird's eye view, we can manage it, and we do that by something that we call the risk register. Some people call it the risk log. And so here is a screen grab of a real live one, and please don't try and read it because it's not that. What we're going to rather do is talk about the headings. And but you are in a situation, so in fact this, the example that we had here, we had hundreds of risks. And so we had to go through this and find ways to analyze it. And it all starts with this one here. So let's have a look. What do you put in the risk register? The first thing that you put in is we give it each one a unique number and a short name so that you don't have to read out the whole meta language every time you refer to it. We put in the risk breakdown structure link because it's so useful for identifying common causes and hotspots. We then put in the meta-language description, and of course you're an expert on that. So in this example, we put the causes, the risks, and the impacts in different columns. I normally do that. And then we assign an owner. And I've only touched very briefly on ownership, but it is very, very important that because your owner is going to take ownership of each individual risk that's allocated to him or her and take it forward through the risk assessment phase and through the risk response phase and so on. So ownership is something that is very, very, very important. And then on the right-hand side, then on the right-hand side, you will see that we have headings called original risk, original impact, and original exposure. And this kind of what we're doing here is having a starting point with recording the original. And so when we come back and review how we do it, how we're doing, we're not going to overwrite these so that we can always see how we're moving. So there's more to come on the risk register. But for now, I'm just going to go back to our PI matrix and say, let's just pass that on to you. I think you should be able to see it now. And so what we do is we have a COUNTIF function in the spreadsheet where we now have the number of risks in each cell. So in this case, if you were to add them up, I can't remember the number, but it's it's over 100, about 106, I think. And so you can see that in the high priority area, where it's color-coded red, we've got 8 risks that we need to be worrying about. These are the things that if they don't get urgent attention could cause us big hassles if they're threats, or provide us with great opportunities, great benefit if they're opportunities. So, if there are any more questions on assessment, pop them into the Q&A. Otherwise, we can carry on to our next segment. Okay, I'm going to go on. So now we've done our risk assessment. So now we need to start planning our risk responses. And you will see that both of the boxes, the highlighted one on the right-hand side and the other one in the bottom left, both are talking about risk responses. So they are highly collaborative. They talk about different aspects of the same thing. One's high level, one's detailed. That's the only difference. So we're going to talk about the risk response strategy now. And after that, we'll talk about risk response actions. So there's risk response strategy selection. So we'll go back to our matrix and say, think about the following. If you've got risks in the top right, what do they represent? What must we do with them? What would we like to see happen? And of course, the answer is, well, it depends. It depends whether we're talking about threats or opportunities. Because if they're threats, we want to get them out of that red area, particularly if it's right at the top right, and into the orange area or into the green area. So that is, we want to manage our threats to a place where they have a lower exposure, reduce the impact or reduce the probability. However, if we've got opportunities sitting in that area, then what we want to do with them is to exploit them, to make them happen. And so what we're doing is, with threats and opportunities, when it comes to responses, our objectives are different. They're opposites. We are, as you can see here, we're managing our opportunities up and we're managing our threats down. The way we do that, as I said, if we're talking threats, is we reduce either or both the probability or impact, depending on what's open to us. And if there are opportunities, we do the opposite. We increase the probability if we can, and we increase the impact should it happen. And of course, first prize would be to do both. So because we're working in opposites, it can get very confusing. And so a lot of people, and I'm one of them, would separate them. And we would have a separate matrix for risks, a separate matrix for threats, and separate from opportunities, so that you would keep risks and opportunities separate. It's much easier to see and not get confused. And quite frankly, I do the same with the risk register as well. Have separate sheets so that it's very obvious when you're ignoring those opportunities which can possibly offset the threats that you're faced with. So how do we do that? Remember that this is our response strategy segment. And so we're talking at a high level. And because our threats and opportunities are going in opposite directions, I'm going to talk about them separately. It's not the one's more important than the other, but I'm going to start with threats. So your threats are to avoid, to transfer, to reduce, or accept. So essentially, if you're going to avoid a threat, then you basically take it out of play entirely. You make the risk irrelevant to your project. The best way to do that is to make the probability zero. It means it can't happen. That is drastic and the least viable, because often those risks are why we're doing it. If we have to change the scope of the project so much that it completely eliminates your top thread, you might be doing away with the reason for the project in the first place. So it's extreme in this case, but it's worth looking at. Transfer means let somebody else come in and handle it, partially or completely. So we have to be a little bit careful with this one, but examples, I'll give you some examples in a moment. But it's easy to think we can transfer a risk, but actually you can't. I'll give you an example. You've got a third-party service provider doing a particular work for you, and you have penalty clauses. If they fail to deliver, they've got to pay you the penalty clauses. But those penalty clauses is not suddenly going to make that deliverable appear out of thin air. So you've still got the risk, even if you've got the penalty there. So you've got to be very careful about transfer. Reduce means change the size, which means, and that's what we were just talking about, as we pull the risks, the threats down to the left, we're reducing the probability, we're reducing the impact. So that's that strategy, and accept obviously means do nothing. So let's take those one by one and have a look. Here's our PI matrix with the threats on the left-hand side. If we were to accept a risk, where would we look? Obviously, we would look where the impact is lowest. We're talking about threats, remember. So if it's very low probability and very low impact, we've got bigger fish to fry in terms of moving up to the top and to the right. We can probably most comfortably accept risks in that area. By the same token, if you could avoid risks, where would you want to avoid them? Potentially, if you could, it would be top right. If you wanted to transfer risks, you would probably transfer it to people who understand that area better. They're specialists in their field. And so they would probably, that wouldn't necessarily change the probability, although it might, but it might certainly affect the impact. And the one that we would probably keep in-house and reduce ourselves is the one with the high probability and the lower impact. But remember that these are very, very much first pass ideas. And typically you have to look at them individually and say, what do we do with each one? But these are, so even if you choose something in the top right and say we need to reduce, at least you've looked at avoid, you've looked at transfer, you've discounted accept because it's too high, and so you would need to make that informed decision. So opportunities have equivalence. So just as we can avoid a threat, we can exploit an opportunity. What we're saying is that we make it happen. We take the uncertainty away and make it certain that we're going to get that opportunity. That's what exploit would mean in the context of opportunities. Opportunities, if we have the opportunity, its equivalent to transferring would be to share, bring in a business partner or a joint venture partner or something like that. The opportunity equivalent for reduce would be to enhance, to increase probability, increase impact, and accept obviously remains accept because you've got, that means do nothing. So that remains the same. So guess what? We have got an example for you. So opportunity. So let's go and look at the opportunities here. I'm going to give you